Hello, folks. We're just going to wait a second as the weight room empties and turns into our Zoom room. Wonderful to see everyone this morning. We'll get started just in a couple of minutes here. We'll let a few more people join in. All right. Okay, it's just a couple minutes after 10 here. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Michelle Stewart. I'm a faculty member at the University of Regina. And we are joining today together, all of us, for the latest workshop in the series, Impact Through Collaboration, How Evidence-Based Research and Evaluation Can Better Support the Nonprofit Sector. Our goal here today is to bring together what we've done, which is a mix of frontline agencies, community organizations, community members, and faculty members, as well as researchers and evaluators who are and are not linked to university settings. What we're trying to do in this series ultimately is to facilitate a number of dialogues that allow us to come together and think a bit about community engagement, think collaboratively about funding structures that are available, and more importantly, the type of work that we're trying to do in the community together collaboratively. And so I would like to start off by recognizing University of Regina is located on both Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories. And I know we have people joining us today from across multiple territories and areas. Speaking today from Treaty 4 territory, I'm hoping that our session can sort of bring us together and have a discussion that really thinks collaboratively, restoratively, and through a lens of reconciliation. What does it mean to collaborate with one another within the broadest of contexts and the largest of knowledges that we can bring together on this territory? And so thank you everyone for joining us today. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation and the discussion that follows. I'll be serving as the moderator predominantly. And so I will bring us into conversation, host the dialogue a little bit, but this is ultimately the product of the collaboration between the University of Regina and the City of Regina. So special thanks as well to Kelly Husak, who's here. Kelly, if you want to wave to folks. Lynn Jidlak. Lynn, I think, has her screen muted, but Lynn's there as well. I don't think David Slater is with us today, but David's been helping at the City of Regina, as well as Emily Grafton through the University of Regina. And so today what we'd like to do is sort of facilitate a conversation in which you're able to learn with our speakers, which includes Dr. Leslie Ann Kewan. Leslie, if you want to wave to folks. There's Leslie. Dr. Jolie Sasakamoose. Jolie. And Dr. Tom Mcintosh. Tom, if you want to wave to folks, there we are. In just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to our panelists. But just to give everyone sort of an idea, words are escaping me, an idea of sort of how we're going to organize the conversation today. It'll be similar to other sessions that you've come to. It's meant to be a roundtable conversation, but first and foremost, we want to give all of our presenters an opportunity to sort of offer a quick snapshot of the work that they're doing. And hopefully each of them will also afford an opportunity for you to sort of better investigate or further investigate the work that they do. What we want is for each panelist to start off with a sort of an organizing question that brings them into our conversation. And then after that, we'll rotate a number of roundtable questions to our participants. Later on, probably around 11:15, we'll open up the dialogue for some audience questions, and we'll put those into the chat set the chat session over there. Kelly will keep an eye on that, as will Lynn, so that we don't necessarily interrupt the speakers, but we get our questions out. And hopefully, as with all of these sessions, this is meant to be the start of potentially more discussions and further collaborations moving forward. So this is an introductory conversation, really looking at the question of evaluation. So we're going to start off here with each panelist having about 5 to 10 minutes to offer their perspective and an overview of their project and collaborations by thinking about this question in particular. Can you describe your evaluation practice? How did these come to be, and how are they unique to your program? I'm going to turn things over first to Dr. Leslie Allen Kewan from Carleton University.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm so delighted to be here with you today. I grew up, as I was saying to the other panelists, in Carleton, Saskatchewan, in northern Saskatchewan, and was born in Weyburn. So it's like returning home, but I'm actually speaking to you today from Ottawa. I am an adjunct professor with sociology at Carleton University. I also hold an adjunct at the University of Regina with justice studies. And in my full-time job, when I'm not doing that, I am the head of research for the Correctional Service of Canada. In the past, I have been on many boards and headed up many community things. One of the most memorable being heading the AIDS network in Alberta, in Red Deer, Alberta, for some time during the 1980s when the HIV crisis was at its head. Really, I'm more a researcher than an evaluator, although often those two things overlap. So my practice is one that I hope I would describe as adaptable. So I don't think that there's a recipe book you follow when you do research or when you do evaluation, and especially community-based evaluations, because each one will need to be different depending on the needs of the organization that you're working with, or the program that you're evaluating, or if you're evaluating a service as a whole. To me, it's important that you start with the needs of the person or people or organization that you're working with, and that you don't impose what you as the researcher or evaluator want to get out of this. Often that happens, and especially when it's you're involving, I'm going to say, an academic in a broad sense, we often want to turn the questions to those of theoretical interest to us, or something that can turn into a report or a journal article or those kind of things. And frankly, I think when you're doing community evaluation, that should be secondary to the actual evaluation or research that you're undertaking for the group, because mostly it should answer their questions first, not yours. And this can be a tricky slope, and it's sometimes often hard to figure out how to do that. I don't really believe in doing, should you do surveys, should you do interviews, I think that should be adapted to the process and not predetermined. As well, I would describe, I think the most important thing that an evaluator or researcher can do is listen, is go in and listen and help. That is where I feel we come in thinking that we know how to do this rather than listening and providing advice and collaborating from the beginning. I think one of the things that I'm acutely aware of and try to work with a lot is to kind of smooth out the power relationships that can happen in a situation like this, and to really make sure that I am trying to be as open as possible and not exerting sometimes the unequal power relationships that can come with your title. And I am quite aware that that happens quite a bit. So I try as much as possible. And so I'm going to try and do that now by suggesting that you call me LA. Everyone calls me LA. No one calls me doctor anything ever. And when that happens, when I'm doing defenses, I always wonder who they're talking about. I'm LA. That's how I prefer to be addressed. And I think it's important to do things like that to try and lay out that it is indeed a collaborative effort, that whatever you're doing in evaluation or research is collaborative. It is not meant to be imposed from the top down or from the researcher down. How unique are what we do? Well, it depends which kind of research you were asking me or evaluation you were asking me to talk about. Certainly the community work that I've done with AIDS networks and that kind of thing is very different than the work that I have led students in when they've evaluated community projects, and is certainly very different than the kind of work we do at the Correctional Service around evaluating our own programs and issues, etc. One of the things that we've recently started to do with the Correctional Service is actually with a project with the U of R to actually try and remove ourselves a little bit from the process and to contract it out to a third party in order to kind of, I think that when you try to sometimes do your own internal evaluation, the bias is about what you want to see eke in to whatever you're doing in the evaluation of the research. I'll just end this by saying that I treat this as a very broad subject matter. Often when we talk evaluation, I think people think, is a program or a perceived, making a difference or working? And that's certainly one kind of evaluation. But there are lots of different kinds of evaluations that can be of assistance, like process evaluations. How are things working in your organization? There are evaluations around how those kind of, are you succeeding in your broad aims, et cetera. And those are important kinds of evaluations as well. So thank you, Michelle.
Great, thanks, LA. That's awesome. Thanks for starting us off. One of the things that we're trying to do with this series, but bringing the University of Regina together with the City of Regina, is not only to try to facilitate connection. Lynn Jidluck, as many of you know, works at the Community Research Unit and is often a point person when community members or agencies might reach out to campus with the idea of a project that they might have or an evaluation they might have. Tom Mcintosh, who's going to speak in a few moments, works with Saskatchewan Population Health Evaluation Research Unit, almost lost it there, and so has been involved in a number of evaluation initiatives as well, collaborating with community partners. And Jolie is going to be speaking in just a moment. One of the things that we want to get to, though, going back to Leslie's comments, is like, what are these power dynamics? In what ways do we collaborate and collaborate robustly together, collaborate in ways that work? And so I know we have a mix of individuals on the line right now. We have community partners, some of whom might be trying to figure out evaluation, some of whom who have already been doing evaluation, and then faculty members or researchers or evaluators who also work either through the university or independently or with an agency. But moving us into the next part of the conversation, we're trying to think as robustly as possible about evaluation. So we're not thinking necessarily with the neoliberal framework of like an audit, right? As Leslie was saying, like it does or it doesn't work. I think we're trying to think about like what sort of ethical practices we have, how do we bring ourselves together in a way that really works? So thinking about praxis, where we have our ethics and our politics together, and that we're collaborating in ways that work for all parties involved, but really taking direction where direction needs to be taken. I know we've been fortunate in the past when the CRU has hosted other events that have focused on community and campus collaboration, that we've had community partners come forward and say that, a community agency can shop around for the researcher or the evaluator that they want to work with, that's an important decision to be made to make sure that the power stays where it needs to. And so with that in mind, I'm going to turn things over to Jolie. And I think Jolie has got a deck that's going to get shared with us.
I just have to figure out how to do it.
Looks good, thank you.
Is that the whole slideshow right there? Is that right?
I don't know if you want to put it on play.
Mm-hmm. Play? Yeah, my students usually talk me through this. Play. Or actually Chelsea talks me through it. Where's play? Is it this one?
Play from start. There you go. Yay.
I'm paralyzed without advice. Okay, let me drop that chat down. Okay, so I would, first of all, I'd just like to thank you for that land acknowledgement and just introduce myself and give you a little bit of context about why I can speak on this topic. I'd like to just share with you, I broke my talk up into three sections based upon the outline of the agenda today. So this morning, the first front half, I'm going to just locate myself, give you the context of why I can speak about this work. Then I'll share with you our approach. And then the second part, I'll start to talk to you about the framework with which we use and the different sort of theories and things that we do to gather that evaluation. And then the last piece, I'll talk about how we collaborate with partners. And then I'm going to leave you with a toolkit and some resources that you can have to start to delve a bit more deeply into this. I would like to say that this is a very dense topic. I'm going to present to you at a very high level. I am not going to be able to unpack for you the concepts that I'm going to present, but I would encourage you, and Michelle and I have already talked about doing some kind of follow-up to this, because I think that the material that I present to you, what I would like to know and what I present on this topic a lot and what I think people really want are some tangible takeaways. And so I'm going to provide you that at the end, but it's going to take me a while to get to that material. So I'd just like to start out by saying why I'm able to speak on this topic. First of all, I'm the research director for the Indigenous Wellness Research Community Network and Wellness Wheel Medical Clinic. So I'm responsible for leading Wellness Wheel research team and supporting traditional ways of knowing alongside Western approaches to well-being. I work with the clinical director, Dr. Stuart Skinner, and our website is wellnesswheel.ca if you want to take a look at that. In Wellness Wheel, we do two types. I'm also an associate professor at the University of Regina in the Faculty of Educational Psychology and Counseling. And we do two types of research out of Wellness Wheel. We do evaluative research on chronic disease management, which is HIV, Hep C, diabetes, COVID-19, and we also look at mental health and addictions. We have 19 clinics located on First Nations communities that affect about 26 First Nations communities. And the second type of research we do is community driven. So that means that while our docs and nurses are doing the interventions and we're evaluating those interventions, I also have relationships in community. So if a community says, hey, we've been working on HIV for 5 years, we're doing great, now we want to expand to diabetes, I will work with that community on getting grants and sort of designing what that research approach would look like. So that's sort of how Wellness Wheel operates in its research. I'm also Anishinaabe, I'm Ojibwe with membership in Chaging First Nation in Ontario. I'm also from Michigan. My mom's community is in Michigan. And then I'm an active citizen of Atakakuk Cree Nation here in Saskatchewan. I've co-authored the Indigenous Cultural Responsiveness Theory, which is now known as the CRF, the Cultural Responsiveness Framework. And that works within the middle ground between Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. And I'm the interim co-scientific director of the First Nations Health and Wellness Network under the Saskatchewan NEAR. I'm also a co-author of the new report that just came out about 2 weeks ago from the Department of Justice Canada, which is called Exploring Indigenous Approaches to Evaluation and Research. And that I've left the email at the end of this PowerPoint so that you can request a copy of that itself, because that's a really good way for you to get a broad overview of evaluation. It had 4 major Indigenous authors on it, and then a summary conducted by all of us with the lens from the Department of Justice. So I'll share all that with you today. So what makes Wellness Wheel's approach to evaluation different? How did this come to be, and how is our approach unique? First of all, I'd like to identify that we look at the colonial context. We identify that there is a history of complex effects on the structure of communities, individuals, and the collective identity and the mental health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. So anyone coming into Wellness Wheel, either as a trainee from undergrad level, community-based researcher, all the way up to our physicians and our specialists, they all go through training on these areas. They need to understand what colonization is. They need to understand that people were relocated and confined to reserves, that they were separated from families, the residential school traumas, the restricting involvement in economy and land, the political marginalization, and that research in the past has treated Indigenous people as test subjects. As I said, I'm going to go over some high-level, dense material, and I'm not unpacking it. So if this is new for you, you'll probably feel a little bit of you'll feel yourself pulled to either be troubled by some of the things I'm presenting to you, or you'll want to know more. And I just encourage you to kind of take notes and kind of figure out where your entry point is here, because not everyone has this information. And so to just start in one location, you might have to dig deep and do some decolonizing work on your own before you really even understand the effects of history on Indigenous people before you start evaluating them. So also one of the things that we ensure that our team has an awareness of is Canada's research history with Indigenous people, that it has been exploitive, that it has been racist and paternalistic, and that it has violated human rights. Again, I'm not going to unpack all this. I think this is areas where you can go and explore on your own what those historical consequences were for us as a people. And what our team does is we look at how this context affects us today. So how does the history of colonization affect the problems, practices, and policies of today? Why this is so important is because 99% of the research that I see and that I evaluate when I evaluate peer-reviewed articles is it's deficit-based. And one of the things that Indigenous and First Nations peoples have been saying, I don't know, for at least the last 20 years is stop with the deficit-based research already. We don't need any more deficit-based research. So by placing the high rates of violence and substance abuse and poverty experienced by Indigenous families into the appropriate context of colonization and assimilation, the policies and evaluators can focus on the resiliencies that people have demonstrated, not the deficits. So that's really what makes Wellness Wheel unique, is that we don't go in and look at any more deficits. We look at the strengths and the resiliencies of the communities and the people within them and how to move forward from there. The other thing that makes us different is our ethical approaches. And Willie Ermine, I love what he says. He says, ethics is the way we treat one another. And so again, very high level stuff here. Each one of these is that I'm going to mention here is something that our team is very familiar with and utilizes on a regular basis. If you're looking at this list right now and you don't know any of the things on the list, I would recommend you start there and start learning about the ethics that exist that protect Indigenous peoples. And I'll start with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, specifically Article number 19, the duty to consult. So we honor that duty to consult. We don't do anything that affects Indigenous people without first engaging in a proper and appropriate consultation to get their feedback and they drive us, we don't drive them. So again, what the first speaker mentioned was being led by the community and the people. We also follow the Tri-Council Policy Statement, in particular module number 9, research involving First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We follow OCAP. If you don't know OCAP, there's a very beautiful online training module. It does have a little bit of a fee to it, but that's a really good place to start learning about OCAP policy. I'm also working with the Indigenous Peoples Health Research Center right now on developing a Saskatchewan-based OCAP policy module. We also use the RCAP, Royal Commission on the Aboriginal Peoples 1996 policy that ensures appropriate respect is given. And then we use specific community research standards, ethics, and agreements. Now, what that means is each individual community, some do not have this, but some have their own research standards, ethics, and protocols, and we use them. And we also use the community traditional cultural protocols. This is not easy work. This is not quick work. So when we do this, it takes a long time not only to train our team and to get them up to speed, but to really have a deep working knowledge of these ethics that protect Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to stop there. And how do I stop sharing? Okay. And that's kind of the summary of how we are a little bit different.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jolie. Just turning off my timer so it doesn't buzz us. We're going to turn things over to Tom Mcintosh in a moment. And, you know, in bringing this cluster of speakers together today, what we're really trying to do is offer a number of vantage points from which to think about your work. But you can already see a theme emerging as far as directionality. Who's guiding that work, who's leading the work, and who's engaged in the work. And so just thinking with some of the language that we've already heard so far, you know, for our community partners on the line, it's really about thinking about the types of language that the researchers that you're collaborating with are using. Jolie just used the language of community driven. That's distinct from community-based or community engaged, right? You could hear that system of accountability and relationality and long-term relationships when a project is community driven. It's not conceived of by an evaluator or researcher from far away. It's the idea, the kernel comes from the community, collaboration and co-design can emerge from there, or a number of the frameworks that Jolie just spoke about. The distinction between that and community-based, the distinction between that and community engaged. Participatory work. These are the types of languages that can be used not only in research, but also in evaluation. So participatory models of evaluation and co-design would be central to a number of the folks that are speaking today, and something that I also do in my own work. I'm going to turn things over to Tom Mcintosh now, and Tom will introduce himself as our other speakers have. Take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. My name is Tom Mcintosh. I'm a professor of politics and international studies at the University of Regina. But for today's purposes, really, I'm the co-director, as Michelle said, of the Saskatchewan Population Health and Evaluation Research Unit, or SPHERU, a rather clunky acronym and title. I'm not responsible for it. We're a bi-university research organization. We operate at both the U of R and the U of S. Michelle Stewart is one of our research faculty. And I also notice on my screen is Akram Mahani, who has recently joined SPHERU as the evaluation coordinator for the project I'm going to talk about. SPHERU is engaged in both community-based and community-driven multidisciplinary research collaborations with a wide variety of urban, rural, and northern communities across the province. We've been in existence for 20 years. Now we are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. But what I wanted to talk about today and give you a bit of an overview of is one of the major U of R initiatives underway right now. It's funded by Employment and Social Development Canada under their New Horizons for Seniors program. And this is our dementia supports in rural Saskatchewan project. And I want to talk about it because it's involving us in a new form of evaluation, which is a collective impact evaluation, this is only our second experience with this. Our first was okay and moderately successful, and we learned a whole lot about what went right and wrong with that one. And so we're now engaged in this new 5-year initiative to implement and evaluate interventions that will enhance the social inclusion of older adults with dementia and their care partners who live in small towns and rural communities in Saskatchewan. And we deliberately focused this in small towns and rural communities because we knew there were a lack of dementia supports. And we're beginning this work in collaboration with a variety of community-based organizations in the province. The project itself is located in the Yorkton area, roughly the boundaries of the old Sunrise Health Authority. We could go into a long explanation of why we picked that area, but it is in fact a sort of a test case for what we're trying to do. Over the next few years, what we will be doing is providing funds to a number of collaborating organizations to deliver interventions that in the first place happen at one of 3 different levels. We're interested in individual level supports, community level supports, things like awareness programs, stigma. Those individual supports are aimed at delivering actual interventions to people with dementia or their care partners. And then we're also interested in organizational level interventions that increase supports for clients, customers, and employees that may be living with dementia. As I said, we're involved in this through a series of partnerships with other sectors and organizations in the area. And it's rooted in an agreement to work within a collective impact approach to both the delivery of the intervention and its evaluation. And as I said, this is new, or has been new to SPHERU in the last couple of years as a way of doing this. And it's proven to be, I think, a really interesting extension of that community-based and now much more community-driven kinds of evaluation work, because it's rooted in this notion of collective impact, which is defined as a commitment of a group of actors from different sectors to a common agenda, solving a specific social problem using a kind of structured form of collaboration. And I just want to run through very quickly some of the key components of how collective impact approaches to both interventions and evaluations. And there's sort of 5 key factors. And the first is the common agenda or shared vision of change, a shared understanding of a problem, and a joint approach to solving it through common actions. And that's really where we've spent the first year or so of this initiative, is building that group of partners, and beginning to help develop a shared understanding of what the situation is in this particular part of the province, a shared understanding of the challenges faced by people with dementia, faced by their care partners, and the like. It's also a commitment to shared measurement, and that is all of the groups agreeing on the evaluation process, led and coordinated by our evaluation coordinator, and thinking about how to build the evaluation into both the implementation and the evaluation of the overall project. A series of mutually reinforcing activities is another key factor here, which is participant activities have to be they're differentiated in that different organizations may be doing different evaluations at different levels, but that they're integrated in a way that they're reinforcing each other. And so the work being done with individual level interventions is also coordinated and collaborating with the work at, say, the community level or the organizational level. It's about also continuous communication, consistent and open communication across all the players. It's about building trust, about assuring mutual objectives, about appreciating a common motivation for their involvement. And finally, and this is one of the things that we discovered out of the last collective impact that we did, is really the importance of a backbone support. That is Sviru's role in this particular initiative, which is we are listed as formally what's called a backbone organization, which is meant to sort of facilitate the collective impact, that has dedicated staff and resources that are there at the disposal of the other organizations, because we recognize that many of our community partners have limited resources, both for the implementation of an intervention, but also for the evaluation, that they may rely on expertise and whatnot and training that we can give in support of that. And so to sort of serve as an overall sort of coordinating body for the collectivity. And so what we've been over the last few years has been, or over the last year and a bit, has been really reaching out to community organizations in and around the Yorkton area, and also trying very consciously to pull in as many rural organizations outside of Yorkton as possible in that surrounding area, through a series of community meetings and webinars, all of which have of course had to be done this way through Zoom. And rolling out a major research initiative through Zoom, you learn a whole lot about new ways of engaging with community partners and community actors. But we're right now in the midst of, at the insistence of our community partners, having them actually undertake collectively a needs assessment in the area to get a much solid picture of exactly what services for people with dementia are out there and where the gaps may be that they see in their own communities, and then beginning to think through from there what the interventions will be. There is a whole website, and a bunch of our resources and materials are all of our webinars and everything, if you want to know more about both the project itself and about the particularities of this approach, that are there. And I will copy and paste the URL, and I'll put it in the chat for people, and you can visit it. And all that material it's there for the taking. So, plunder it to your own, to whatever extent you think it will help you. So I'll leave it there, and thank you again for letting me be part of this. I think this is a really fascinating conversation that we're about to have.
Great, thanks so much, Tony. I'm going to turn to our panelists in a moment for the start of our roundtable sort of discussion. But, you know what I want us to be thinking about as a group. So that includes the researchers and evaluators that are on the call right now that might be associated to an institution or to the university, as well as our community partners and individuals that are on this call. You know, what are these approaches? And each of our panelists have distinction in their approach, and then there's some shared areas, of course, where those approaches, you know, kind of intersect. But, you know, Tom used the language of collective impact as the approach that Sphero uses. Whoops, there's my timer. Tom was done fast. There's, you know, there's the language of participatory or action-based work that's sort of been implied in a number of the projects. Jolie used the language of community-driven as the approach. LA talked about the collaborative nature of this type of work or that type of approach. The other thing I'm thinking that we hear a lot about too, though, is what does commitment look like? What does ethics look like? A lot of these projects do implicitly or explicitly kind of use the language or concepts of co-design. So working together to identify, you know, what are the challenges? How do we want to address the challenge? Is there an evaluation framework we can put together that meets the needs of all to the best of our ability? You know, in a lot of discussion here, I think about a strengths-based approach, and Jolie spoke about that at the start as well, that there can often be an implicit deficits-based approach, whether we see it or not as such, which means that we're sometimes anticipating where the barrier could be. And that barrier could potentially be an individual or an agency. But if we're always coming from a strengths-based approach, we're always thinking about what the best of everything is that we can offer. And from that perspective, we're never really starting anew. We're not starting fresh. We're not starting or reinventing the wheel. We're always building and developing and working together from a very strong base. And that includes multiple knowledges, ways of understanding, community knowledge, institutional knowledge. Sometimes we have to work a lot on decolonizing that knowledge though. And then really thinking like, how do we collaborate and do the best with what we have, understanding that everyone brings strengths into these projects. So for the first question, we're going to go into roundtable discussions, give each panelist a couple of minutes to speak to this. So roundtable question number 1. We will start with what orientates your work. What are your guiding principles, your ways of knowing when it comes to evaluation? Can you also speak to what are the reasons for undertaking evaluation in research or in project delivery? It's a sort of a broad set of questions. I know each of the panelists have already spoken a little bit to this, but now we're just kind of doing that deeper dive. Jolie, does it work to throw it to you first?
Yes, if I can unmute my stuff. Okay, let me get to my slide here. Is it the what orients our work? Yeah, okay, let me just share my slide. Okay, so that's a good question about what orients our work and how we move forward. So I will start with Indigenous perspectives. So from Indigenous perspectives, as Indigenous peoples, we've always done research and have searched for understanding and ways of being and knowing the world around us just in order to survive. We just maybe didn't call it research. So Indigenous peoples have had their own ways of collecting information about their people and about moving forward. And one of the things that has happened since 2017 is here in Saskatchewan, the First Nations people, I'm not speaking about Métis people, I'm speaking about the First Nations communities, the 74 communities under the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, did a collective action over a 3-year period. They did engagement and they created the cultural responsiveness framework. Then they asked Indigenous scholars to create that into a theory. And that's one of the things that I worked on. And so in 2017, the Indigenous cultural responsiveness theory was developed and written and identified by First Nations people that this is the framework they want used when doing any research or governance or policy with First Nations people in Saskatchewan. And I realized that that is, you know, frustrating for some people to know that we are sort of imposing a framework, but the framework has been done with research and done with intention. And so if you are working with Indigenous peoples in this province in particular, I would behoove you to learn about that framework and start using it in your work. I'm going to explain the framework a bit so that you have an understanding of why it shapes our work. So first, we start off with a relational worldview. And that relational worldview starts off with the individuals that we work with, their families, and the individual community that we're serving. We also look at the relationship that the people have to the land around them, the spiritual aspects, the cultural aspects, and we turn this into a holistic approach. We do not follow, we've not created anything of our own. Everything has been created by the elders and interpreted and designed into an academic way so that Indigenous academics and other scholars can understand it. You might have heard of the 4 R's of Indigenous research. We have unpacked that a little bit more and added a 5th R. Again, these are things that there's a lot of literature out there on this. I'm just presenting you at the high level. I would recommend that you dig deep and figure out what each of these R's mean and what that looks like when you're developing your evaluation. So in general, the 5 R's are respect of the Indigenous cultural identity, relevance. This one is super, super important. I have researchers coming to me all the time with research topics. And I say to them, unless the community has driven that topic or led that topic, I don't even acknowledge it. I don't pay attention to it. So when I'm training my students and they bring all these topics to me, they really have to be engaged. They have to be driven by community. Communities are tired of us imposing academic agendas on them or evaluative agendas. They don't need us to come into their community and do our work. They need us to support their ability to build their capacity so they can eventually do the work on their own. That's a very different mindset. There's also reciprocity in relationships and in knowledge sharing. And this goes 2 ways. And I've really struggled with my team in one area. So for example, reciprocity means that when we go into a community that we're not just extracting data and then publishing, that we're actually doing something in that community that is a win for that community, that the community identifies is a solid win for them, but it goes both ways. And one of the things that I've noticed about a lot of non-Indigenous teams is that they're so worried about the reciprocity, which I've trained them well, that's great. They're worried about the reciprocity, but they forget that there's a reciprocity to come back to the team. And so what has been happening is there's been a very paternalistic approach. And so we give so much and then we don't ask for that reciprocity back. And then we basically enabled a dysfunctional relationship. And it's played out in a couple of times for us. And I've tried, so one of the things I say is reciprocity is a 2-way street. So as we give and we support the community and their efforts, we are learning and growing in our efforts as well. And I'll skip the responsibility from 1 minute to jump down to reflexivity, because reflexivity is the piece that we added to the 5 R's, to the 4 R's. Reflexivity was based upon Kovach's work in 2010, who was the author of Indigenous Methodologies. Reflexivity is really changing as a result of the co-constructive relationship and knowledge sharing. What that means is you as a researcher, you as an evaluator are going to experience change by the nature of you going in and operating in a way that's different from your norm. And so what does that look like for you? And that's what we call reflexivity. We just had an article that just came out. I think it's in publication right now. I've listed at the end of the PowerPoint. Reflexivity is a tool that you can use in addition to any in addition to any methodology that you're using as a way to reflect upon your own growth and change as a result of your work in the relationship. The other aspect of the cultural responsiveness framework is about finding a middle ground. I don't know if you know of Willie Ermine, he's a very well-respected elder in this province, and he's talked about this ethical space. Middle ground, ethical space is virtually the same thing. The ethical space is that cooperative spirit between Indigenous peoples and Western institutions in order to create new currents of thought. If you don't create an ethical space, a middle ground where those 2 diverging groups can come together and be safe and position Indigenous ways ahead, you're not going to get much progress, because it's in that healthy, interactive, ethical space, that middle ground, that the conversation can even occur to get that evaluation off the ground or to get that situation moving. I find this to be the most difficult place, establishing a middle ground. Middle grounds are often non-Indigenous people taking leadership, driving the agenda, moving it forward, having some Indigenous consultation on the side, maybe an elder who opens in prayer, acknowledging the land, and that's about the extent of it. That's not enough. The ethical space is where the positionality comes in, where Indigenous agendas are first and prioritized. There's also a concept called 2-eyed seeing that we use in our work. And this is, again, in the cultural responsiveness framework. And that's the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and the strengths of, and I say evidence-based Western practices, and bringing them together. And then there's this concept called harmonization, which was an addition by our team, and that was Carrie LaValle's work. And so that was my PhD student. And so it's within the area of ethical space that the strengths of Indigenous ways and the strengths of evidence-informed Western practices are considered. And I add this piece, even though it's evidence-based, if it does not harmonize with Indigenous ways, it is tossed out. So a perfect example of that might be CBT as a therapeutic approach. Often doesn't work for Indigenous peoples, definitely has a strong evidence base behind it, but because it doesn't harmonize culturally, we don't use it, and that's our justification for not using it. I have some additional slides that break this apart more. I have 4 additional slides that I'm not going to go over because we don't have enough time, but basically I've unpacked some of this stuff a little bit deeper that you can kind of go into. One of the things I want to say about establishing the middle ground in the culture responsiveness framework also identifies that there are 4 protective factors built into this framework, and that's why I suggest you use this framework. This framework identifies, first of all, that it's spiritually grounded. So that means we engage in all the cultural and spiritual practices of the community that we're working with. It's community specific. So whether it's an Indigenous urban population or a First Nations community, everything we do is specific to that community. It's strengths-based, which we've all just talked about a little bit, and it's trauma-informed. And by trauma-informed, I mean, go back to my original slides where I talked about the historical context and colonization. We as a team understand that trauma, and we let it inform us in everything that we do as we design our evaluations so that we're not re-hurting people. And I just want to speak, so I got these 4 additional slides here that you can go over when you get this. And then I just want to address this final piece. In order to adopt
the next speaker.
In order to adopt an Indigenous approach, there must be the realization that one homogeneous evaluation will not be all-encompassing due to the diversity and complexity of community and cultural contexts. However, there are guiding principles present in all Indigenous evaluations. The CRF model provides an overarching framework to plan, develop, execute, and evaluate programs to support Indigenous peoples. And adhering to the spirit of the framework would begin the process of decolonizing programs in order to better address the needs of Indigenous peoples. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jolie. And just for folks that were joining late, as you heard, Jolie is offering the full deck that you can look at after. So as she has said a number of times, these are meant to be sort of high level kind of vantage point from which to see a number of different topics. And for some folks that might mean doing a lot of background research. For other folks, this might be a ready-made resource. And it's, I believe, based off of something that has just been published here in 2020. We're just going to turn over to Tom, returning to question 1. What orientates your work? What are your guiding principles?
I guess, first and foremost, the approach that we've always tried to root our work in it through, both in the research projects, research with communities, and the evaluation work we do, is that the people in the community know the community, and it's building on, as Jolie said, and working with Indigenous communities, working with non-Indigenous communities, as most of our work is focused. Those communities know themselves, and there's much more knowledge and sort of insight into the needs of the community, the strengths of the community, and how to, and I take seriously Jolie's comment about a strengths-based approach is an important one in terms of what you have and how to build on that to fill in and expand on that to meet where there may be shortfalls and shortcomings. So it's very much about building those, and this gets a little bit into the second question, but it's about those, that expectation or that understanding that communities are the place where you have to start with your orientation in terms of building those relationships over time. In terms of that sort of last part about the reasons for undertaking evaluation, Part of it is, the very simple thing, and you want to know whether what you're doing is having an impact. But it's also about without a sort of robust and thoughtful evaluation process, it becomes very difficult to build on interventions and to pull interventions together to sort of, as we're doing in that kind of collective way, without a kind of a very strong and robust evaluation that's deeply embedded into the intervention itself. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Tom. I had to turn off my alarm again. The thing that Tom's getting at, I think also, is all the ways in which we orientate. How do we engage with the community? How do we think about, like some of the questions that Jolie was raising, how do we think about capacity building? How do we sustain the work? And what I want to do then is offer an opportunity here for LA to join in the discussion, and then we'll switch to a new question. But LA, if you want to take us through your thoughts on question number 1, what orientates your work, and some guiding principles.
Great, thanks, Michelle. I don't know that I'm going to offer much that's unique that Jolie and Tom haven't already said, but I will offer a couple of observations here. And the first one is that I and the teams that I direct, I try to take the idea that that if you parachute in, if you just say, I'm here to do your evaluation, that is not going to be productive. It doesn't work very well. And that often, as I've said before, the listening piece needs to happen throughout. And so you don't want to preconceive as a researcher and evaluator how you're actually going to do this without going and listening first. And that often means being community involved and staying involved with the communities that you want to do work with outside of the research project. This piece I find is often missed by researchers and evaluators. I want to get involved in this project, so they think about parachuting themselves in and offering their many services and then parachuting themselves out afterwards when they've accomplished that. In my practice, that is not anything that I like to do. I find that very problematic, and it doesn't lead to good relationships from the start. And that can be frustrating for especially things like graduate students that are looking to do work, because you're asking them to establish relationships before they actually get involved in doing the work that they want to do. And this is not often how they thought about doing research or evaluation. I think it's a vital concept that you as the researcher or evaluator or the group that you're working with would have research and would have involvement from the community with the community that was outside of the research and evaluation work you're doing. And that was true community engagement and involvement. That wasn't just you plopping in to do that one thing and then plopping back out afterwards. And that often relationships within evaluation and research happen over very long periods of time. So they evolve over time, and it's only when you see them as evolving over time and that they're going to change and grow. This is kind of maybe a bit of the reciprocity that Jolie was talking about, that you're going to grow as a researcher and as a person in doing this work, and you're going to see ways that you can do it and help with that. And I think one of the things that I'll just end with this piece is that I really think it's important, if you're on the community side, if you're the person looking to have evaluation or research done, that you think about involving people in the conversations around doing that from the very beginning. It's actually incredibly difficult to be asked to come in and construct an evaluation of something that's been in place for a long time, that was never set up to gather information as it went along. And that's often what you need to do, is gather that information from the beginning. And I often think the other piece is that evaluation is often seen as something that you need to do because some government agency or funding agency wants to see whether or not your program was effective, or and so you rush at the end of as funding comes to a draw to try and show that. It's very difficult to do it that, and I don't think you really get much out of those kind of evaluations because they're designed specifically for that purpose at all alone. Whereas I see evaluation and research as a continual process. It's something that your organization can use throughout the implementation of a project or throughout the delivery of its services. And it doesn't have an endpoint. It's something that goes on continually and that you build on continually. And I think this is a really important piece. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Michelle.
Sally. We're going to go into table question 2 in just a moment, but just wanted to sort of tie some pieces together here. And I think some of them do land more broadly within the question of capacity building. Each of the speakers have offered different perspectives on thinking about capacity building, and this is sort of undoing a very old school approach sometimes to evaluation that LA was just speaking about, the sort of tick box approach, right? And evaluation got done tick, and all of the damaging ways in which that type of evaluation practice can play out, and sort of moving away from that because it's an unsustainable approach, some might say, but it's definitely one that maybe becomes quite unaccountable because we're not necessarily focusing on long-term relationships then. We're not doing that long-term and sustained work. We're doing maybe that type of parachuting work that LA was just talking about. So if we're thinking more about how the evaluators on this call are focusing up their work, we're thinking more about the two-way relationship that Jolie was speaking about, these questions of reciprocity. We're thinking also about, as Tom spoke about, the idea around a collective impact. A process that is meant to be continuous, a process that, is a process of ongoing learning and development to sort of continue to facilitate this broader and broader understanding of like, how is this project transformational potentially? And we're thinking beyond, again, that idea that we're just going to go in, do evaluation and leave. And if we're taking from Jolie's comment also, whether we're using a trauma-informed approach or we're just thinking really kind of collaboratively with the folks that we're working with, if we go in and do a really quick evaluation, there's a lot of stress that can surround that. There can be a lot of frustration, a lot of misunderstanding, versus, as LA just spoke about, but Tom and Jolie have also spoken about, really designing together from the start, right? So that we really have a strong understanding about what evaluation can do, what evaluation is meant to do, and how to do that work collaboratively and together. So going to roundtable question number 2. Let's turn to relationships as our focus in community-based practices. So I'm probably going to have, I believe Tom is going to speak first on this one. How do you build up and sustain relationships in your evaluation practices? For example, how is community and program staff engaged from the outset and throughout the project? How do you address these challenges? How are principles of reciprocity implemented? So how do you give back to those involved in the process, et cetera? So I'll open it up there. Tom, go ahead and take it away.
Well, first and foremost, I guess, it is about building those relationships, and those can only be built when the program staff, say on our end, are actually in those communities and spending as much time as possible in those communities, talking, learning, finding out about the organizations we're working with, about the people we're working with. And that's incredibly, it's a lot of time, as LA was saying, at the front end of sort of building a relationship, building trust, building understanding, getting to know and trying to understand the perspective of the community, both the community organizations and the broader community as well. It's also, we spend a lot of time with making sure we have, beyond our sort of project partners themselves as organizations, and sort of broader groupings of people that serve as advisors and checkpoints along the way as the process involves. So, advisory boards and advisory groups that continue to have input into how we do our work. And I think it is very much about trying to build that process of sort of reciprocity in these relationships. One of the things that we've been faced with in this latest initiative that I talked about with the dementia project is we can't go into those communities. We can't be spending time in Yorkton and Priestville and Moosomin and all of those places where we're working with, and we're trying a lot to do it virtually, and it is proving really, really challenging to build the same kind of relationships that you have that when you can sort of sit down face to face in a community where you can actually walk around the community and sort of get a feel for the place where the work is being done. One of the things we're facing right now, at the same time that this has created a set of barriers, it's also created a set of opportunities, because our interest is in social isolation, and we're in a period where we know social isolation in particular in our project around people with dementia is increasing. And the technology may in fact be one way in which to reduce that social isolation in ways that we probably wouldn't have thought of necessarily, and that the community groups that we're working with it's been really interesting in some of our conversations. They're beginning to see how they've managed to continue to do their work with the people they serve and the programs they deliver. And so they're beginning to think about the work they want to do with us in a different way as well. And so it's been a barrier, but it's also provided some interesting opportunities in terms of building relationships in different ways. So I'll leave that.
Sorry, lost my computer screen underneath my paperwork. Thanks very much, Tom. Next up, I'm going to send it to Leslie.
Thanks, Michelle and Tom. I really like what you were saying, Tom. I think it's a really vitally aspect about this continuous piece. And I understand completely how COVID and the restrictions we face now are making that incredibly difficult. It's really hard to establish a relationship with someone that you've never met and never been involved with when it's only virtual. One of the things that I always encourage the teams I lead to do is to actually in developing the relationships, is actually to spend some time with the group that they're involved with, doing some actual work with them, not or for them. So going in and being one of their volunteers for a week or two, going in and actually taking the training that they offer to the people that are delivering their projects, going in and actually doing that work and actually experiencing it themselves, rather than just coming in as that outsider that's going to watch from afar and give some surveys and tick some boxes, but to say, you should go and be part of that work. And there are differing concepts on whether or not this is a good thing. But to me, and our approach has always been that you actually need to experience. You can't, that it's not enough to just be seen from the outside, an observer from the outside. That's actually important to experience and to be, and that you shouldn't actually even develop the approach until you've experienced. So once you've been involved in the work itself, then that can be a way, then and only then should you start with a discussion with the groups that you're working with as a researcher about what that evaluation or research would look like. because as otherwise you're imposing your thoughts and your worldviews and everything else from the very beginning, rather than trying to learn that from the going on. And I think that's part of the reciprocity thing. What do I as a researcher learn from that? Everything. I learn more about my community. I learn more about the people I'm working with, and I learn more about the organization. And I learned some vital skills that I might never have had before. So for instance, I did some work with Meals on Wheels in a community once, and I actually learned how to cook better because I went and volunteered in the kitchen for several weeks at lunchtime, or in the morning as they were preparing the meals. And I actually learned from one of the, and this may seem silly, but it was important to me, and I've used it throughout my life, how to properly chop an onion. And that may seem like that's a silly thing to learn, but I think it's when you engage with this as a whole person, not as just the researcher or just the evaluator, but as a person as a whole. That's how you learn. And that's how you hopefully are providing a service that's more holistic, that is involved and embedded with the organization as itself. And that's why I'm going to return to the idea that when you're addressing this, you have to really think about what will happen after the evaluation is technically over. If you never engage with that organization again, because now you're done your evaluation, then in my view, you aren't being a very good evaluator or researcher. It's about a continued sustained involvement, because part of what comes, I think, is important is that you become engaged with whatever they're doing, that you become engaged in that, and it becomes part and parcel of how you understand the world, and therefore you would stay engaged with it afterwards. And that's a piece that I think we often miss. How do you get program staff engaged from the beginning? Well, part of that is, as I said, that you actually go and experience that. How do you get engaged with them? Well, if they see you there as a person of service from the outset, then they're more likely to want to involve that relationship, because it's not always taking from your perspective. The other thing that I encourage my teams to do is to actually be really involved in providing, being willing to have conversations that are outside the evaluation. Outside. So often, for instance, I'll be asked, or my researchers will be asked, well, I really have thought about, I would love to do this by a person who's involved in the organization. It may have nothing to do with the evaluation. It may be about how to go back to school as an adult, which I did. Or it might be about, how did you choose what your discipline was? All those things to me are, if you get involved in those kind of conversations, or how do you chop an onion, they're much more important than some of the conversations around the evaluation themselves, because they allow you to begin to understand each other. And that's, to me, where the real reciprocity comes in, is sure, there's a services provided back and forth, but more than anything, if we've established good relationships, they don't become about services. They become about knowing each other better. And I think that that's one of the vital things that we sometimes forget. Thank you, Michelle.
Hi, folks. We have a lively house, so there's some fun background sounds here. I'm going to turn things over to Jolie in just a moment to sort of finish us up in this section. But I think this sort of metaphor of how to chop an onion is a good one for us to think with. From my perspective, whether we're doing evaluation, research, or from my perspective, grassroots organizing in our community, it's always about that first step, making connection, right? And the time it learns one to correctly chop an onion, or to cook together, make a meal together, spend time together, get to know one another, we start to better understand our own investments into a particular project. And here, whether that be Meals on Wheels or longer term projects that we work, I think this idea of like, how to chop an onion gets us back down to the ground. And I think all of the evaluators that and researchers that are on the call today that are sharing their insights are invested in these long-term sustainable relationships with communities. But what we're trying to get at is like, what does that look like? Why does it look that way? And so who better to guide us through part of that discussion is Jolie. Jolie, I'll turn it over to you here for you to reflect also on question 2. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you now, yes.
Okay. Okay, so basically, I think everyone's kind of addressed the issue of relationships. So a true Indigenous approach involves authentic relationships and input from Indigenous partners, leaders, and the population being served. And really don't believe that, I don't even know why you would be doing research with a First Nation or Indigenous community unless they've reached out to you. I would never cold call a community and say, I'm interested in doing this project. I would never do that because again, like I work from a community driven perspective where the community tells me what they want and need, and then we morph into that. And the way I agree with LA and what she said, like we are in Saskatchewan, and part of the reason I haven't left my position here to go to another province is because I've been here 9 to 10 years, and I have really strong relationships with the elders and the First Nations government here. If I go to another province, I have to start over. And it took me 5 years before a First Nations community ever even called me, because I was establishing myself in this province as a, with integrity and as a solid researcher. So these things do not happen easily. And how Wellness Wheel got off the ground was our clinical director was a physician in a community. It was that's how it started. And then the community wanted more, and he brought more, and it morphed, over the last 5 to 7 years. We work with the elders, we work with the knowledge keepers, the community members, the leaders, the program facilitators, and we are the evaluators. And the thing that sometimes we even encounter is that we might be in conflict with the community's leadership because we're working with the community's other entity over here. And so navigating these relationships can be very political. We almost lost one of our programs when we had the health director changed, and the new health director came in and fired all our nurses. And so we were like, what do we do? We don't have the ability to control what goes on in community. We often have to just pivot. We pivot all the time, and we have to adjust. And I think one of the bigger challenges I see with academics, especially like the highfalutin academics, is that they don't understand that concept. And so when their agenda gets morphed or changed, they really resist and they struggle. And so I often say to people, like, I know that there appears to be money for research in Indigenous areas, but it takes a very strong person with a lot of depth and understanding to do this work, and to know that it's often not your career that is going to get pulled forward from this work. Your career will actually take a back seat. So you have to be okay with a lot of that sort of maneuvering behind the scenes with these relationships. I agree with LA. Part of the reason that I actually am not over a provincial wide body is because I can't manage 74 First Nations. We have 19 clinics in community, and I feel like I personally, as one of the only Indigenous scholars, cannot even manage the pull from those 19 to 26. So I can't take on more communities and support them. I personally have to recognize like my limitations as an Indigenous scholar and an Indigenous researcher, because one of the things, and COVID has definitely changed that, but one of the things we often heard from our communities is we weren't there enough. And as you know, it's costly to travel and it's hard. So if you are going to take on a relationship with a community, make sure you have the resources to serve them and to be with them in the process, because nothing is worse than taking on a commitment and then not following through. So with collaboration and partnership, what we work to do is we work with the community to plan a program and evaluation in the context of what the topic is or the issue is. We work with the community, with them on the interpretation of the data. So we actually will take the data that we have, we take it back to community, we let them interpret it for us, and then we let them define how we're going to disseminate it. And the evaluation must be used to produce a direct benefit to the community. So we may get our peer-reviewed publications out of it, but maybe they're getting a recipe book, or maybe they're getting a manual, or maybe they're getting, I mean, we've had some very creative outputs. Some of the knowledge translation we're doing on one of our grants right now is literally translating into food security and hydroponic growing. So I think that you have to, when it really comes to dissemination of results, really think about what would benefit the community. And the other thing I would say that LA said is, once you start developing these relationships, and this is where I caution students when students want to get involved on projects, it's like, you don't just go in and get out. You go in, you build that relationship, and the community doesn't want you to leave. If you've built a solid relationship, they want you to stick around. This is one of our projects that we have with one of the communities that we're developing a healing and wellness center. They have the last standing residential school on their reserve, and we're building a healing and wellness center. And we've been with them for 3 years, just doing consultative research, supporting the First Nation and trying to figure out what they would want that program to look like. In summary, I would just say that the principles of Indigenous program evaluation are dependent upon the First Nations group or the community partner, and they can vary considerably based on the project, the community needs, and the capacity or interest and engagement. There is definitely not a cookie cutter approach, but there are some consistencies across, and that I think that in particular, these presentations have laid out some of those foundations, and then I've left you some tools here that you're invited to access whenever you have a chance. And I'll leave this PowerPoint with the team so they can get it to you.
Awesome. Oh, let's see if my camera comes back on. Great. Thanks so much, Jolie. We're going to switch gears here in a couple of moments. And I'm just directing folks to the chat. I know that sometimes when we go full screen and we come back out, you might lose sight of the chat. For those that are a little newer to PowerPoint, or sorry, to PowerPoint. to Zoom. If you just click the chat feature on the bottom, it'll open up a conversation that's also happening on the side. Included there are some additional comments from Jolie, some links from Tom Mcintosh, as well as the list of questions we've been asking our presenters so far, and just echoing some of the gratitudes that are coming through on the chat as well. Thank you so much for our participants who have taken their time today to share their perspectives on the work that they do. One of the things that I just kind of pulled from towards the end of Jolie's section there is the question around dissemination. You know, and Jolie was saying that, you know, the community defines what dissemination looks like, and as Jolie said, that could be a cookbook, that could be you know, a hydroponics project, a number of different approaches to try to figure out what comes from the knowledge and what to do with the knowledge. And I think a lot of our researchers and evaluators on this call today are action-based researchers. That might be a term that gets used sometimes by some, but these are folks that are sustaining relationships. Evaluation becomes part of a holistic approach to the practices and relationships that they've developed over time. You know, and so one thing I was sort of thinking about and listening to our speakers is, you know, how do we talk about entry and sustainability? And I think it's important when we do sessions like this, especially for students that might be on the call, for individuals that might be training to be evaluators. You know, going back to Jolie's original comment, Jolie was saying that she would never go into a location she's never been invited, right? That wouldn't even be the beginning of a project, right? That these are community-driven projects. So the invitation, the idea, the kernel first comes from the community. But are we starting to, or have we ever thought to propose a project or to begin a project or to start to design a project in which we would not be able to sustain a longer-term relationship with the community or the partners or the individuals we're working with? And so I think one of the things that we want to be thinking about is the ways in which the sustainability of the project is sustaining our capacity to honor the promises or commitments we've made, as Jolie just said, sustaining our relationships beyond the scope and scale of a particular project, you know, the funding that might go into an evaluation, and the ways in which those are part of a broader commitment to the work that we do, and to make that work as accountable as possible, which has been one of the things that's been a theme throughout today. One thing I'm going to do right now is ask our participants, the audience participants, to start to fill up the chat. Kelly from the city of Regina is going to be monitoring the chat. What are the questions that you have for our speakers? what's some feedback you would like to see. But if you have questions, you can start to load those up into the chat. You can either send those privately to Kelly or you can put them in a thread to everyone. We'll try to bring those into conversation. The other thing I'd encourage people to do is to start to brainstorm some language or words that they would use to describe community-based evaluation or evaluation, what it means to them. Sometimes in a workshop like this, it might strike you, especially for our community partners and organizations, the things that are really resonating for you right now, the things that are being said that you're like, yes, that's what I would want to see if I collaborate on evaluation. Maybe just take a moment and start to throw those into the chat. It's an opportunity to mark things that you know are important and what could be the beginning of partnerships moving forward, but it's a friendly reminder to yourself what matters. I'm going to switch over and throw a question to our panelists as we wait to get questions from the audience. From your perspective, what is a critical component to effective evaluation practices, and how can or should evaluation give back to the community? And I know that folks have already spoken a little bit to this, but opportunity to underline and reinforce if you like. And maybe I'll turn that over to Jolie first.
Sure. Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, and understanding if folks feel like they've already spoken to it, it's just an opportunity to emphasize, especially we've had an audience members come and go. So Jolie, from your perspective, what is a critical component or components to effective evaluation practices, and how could or can evaluation give back to the community?
We didn't touch on this at all, but I think it's using methodological approaches that make sense to the community, like focus groups, conversational method, those approaches that, maybe a survey wouldn't be the best approach, right? So thinking about what methodological approach makes sense for the community and the population being served, and then going over the data with them, making sure that when the data comes back in, I'll just say this will probably freak people out who use qualitative coding, but one of the things, and I think the article that Carrie LaValle and I just got published speaks to this, is we don't code our data. We don't decontextualize the data, break it up into themes and code it. We actually leave it intact and we theme it based upon the intact nature. It's almost offensive to code data and pull it apart from the context of the person who held that story. So we really look at not decontextualizing our data and really understanding the methodological interpretation. To my knowledge, there's only 2 analysis methods that have come out from an Indigenous perspective, and that's Carrie Barrasa's CDAP analysis method, which has been published, and Carrie LaValle's and my reflexivity process, which is an additional process that you can add. So that's what I would say is really that data analysis process and the methodological ways in which you collect it.
Great, thanks, Jolie. And a good note here that we're talking about this massive topic of evaluation. And so we're just doing little quick dives in, but a good point right now. We haven't talked a lot about methodology. Thank you. I'll throw the question next to Tom.
Yeah, I think Jolie's right. I think the methods that you choose have to be really reflective of the community, and it's got again, it goes back to, and LA talked about this too. Too often, we've been called and we've been doing this project. Can you come and do the evaluation now that the project is ending? When you build it in from the beginning and it's part and parcel of the whole process of whatever intervention or research that you're undertaking, you develop, I think, then a commitment to the methodologies and to the outcome of the evaluation itself to serve the interests of the community, rather than too often the evaluation is designed to serve the interests of the funder or who is ever wherever the money is coming from for whatever intervention. And we've really tried to sort of from the very beginning with communities to get them to start thinking about what is it you want, and what is it that you want to come out of this, and how do you then build in a set of processes and the appropriate kinds of methods that may be some mix of both qualitative and quantitative. And then also, again, sitting back or coming back to the community with the idea too of going through the data with them and making sure that what you've done is actually meeting the needs that they have, and it's answering the questions that they have, much less so than the questions that the funder have. Those will come eventually if you do it right from the community's point of view, and if it's serving their sets of interests.
Great, thanks, Tom. I'm going to throw it over to LA now. Same question.
Thanks, Michelle. I think this is an interesting one, because I think one of the things that I have tried in the past, and sometimes successfully and sometimes not so successfully, is to, once you build that relationship and you're having that conversation with the group or project or community that you're working with, is to really help them understand how they can work better with the funders they might be seeking funding from. And I mean, I'm used to navigating that world. I understand grants and how that works. And it's not that I can give, it's not that I'm saying I would do that for them, but it may be in helping them ask the questions from the beginning that will allow them to gather the information. So when it's time to provide something to the funder, they've got that. So to me, good evaluations and research also play that role, that they're trying to make that, because of the experience you may bring, you understand what's going to have to be answered 4 years from now, what the question is likely to be 4 years from now. And that may not be exactly what the community wants to answer, and I appreciate that, but they may need to answer that in order to continue the funding. And so part of what I like to engage in the conversation with, if I'm involved early on, is that conversation about how do we marry together the reporting kind of needs that you have along with the things you really want to know, right? Because often what the funder wants to know is not what the organization or the people involved want to know. And as hard as that can be, and as much as that seems like, it can often seem like a waste of time, if it can be really easy for an organization or a project to become very distracted at the end to try and answer those funder questions without trying to understand how you're going to answer them from the beginning, and really explore the ways that you can weave most pieces together. I think one of the things that I am always trying to do, is that I think is important, is to actually allow feedback around what you've written, if you're submitting it somewhere. And so too often researchers take the information, and Jaleese talked about this as well, and they just walk away with it and they use their own interpretations about what's there. And I think it's actually vital that you allow the organization to understand some of the interpretation of what you're gathering. So they may have, and often I don't wait until I'm writing to do this. So for instance, if there's a focus group, I think I often will do a debrief with the organization within a day or two of that focus group. What did they learn from that? What are they understanding, and how does that work? I think that's really important. And, I am a big proponent of sometimes you may need, I've done a lot of survey work, and that may be, it may be a necessary component to do the reporting piece, but it won't be ever enough to answer the broader questions that the organization or the project or the community has. And so you have to always find a way to bring those pieces together if you can. Thanks, Michelle.
Great, thanks, LA. I've got some questions that are coming in to me privately as well. So I think I'm gonna throw the first question out and then I'll switch it over to Kelly. So this first question, we'll start with Jolie, and then I'm gonna open it up to the other panelists. In light of COVID restrictions, how do you suggest we get the kernel of what the community might need, assuming there's previous deep-rooted relationships in that community? So we'll throw it to Jolie first, and then I'll open it up to see if other panelists would also like to add some perspectives.
I'm not sure what you mean by kernel. I mean, we have right now 19 communities, and one of the things that, so we have clinics in 19 communities, and we had to basically hustle when COVID hit and map a virtual clinic on top of it. So that's how we respond. We mapped a virtual clinic on top of it. We got a grant to get iPads and cell phones out there, but each community is different. 2 of our communities right now are in a major hot zone for COVID outbreak. So they're so preoccupied right now. We're not going to be in that community for months. Like, we're locked out and down, still supporting, but just not able to really go in. So I don't really know the answer to that. It's the question I think we all have to ask and answer is, how do we build community in a time of COVID? And virtual technology is the only answer I have, and knowing that we don't often have even strong internet in some of our communities. So it's a challenge that I think all of us are facing across cultures, across communities, across everything. And it's something that we have to think about, because with the population that I work with predominantly doesn't have access to technology. And even though I switched a lot of my efforts and energies into the Regina area, I'm still faced with the same problems in the city, right? Poor, no technology. So even being urban doesn't necessarily solve that issue. I think that the communities who are used to us being there have reached out on their own for what they need, and so that's coming to us, but it is based upon having a very strong relationship and knowing that we already had that in existence. Honestly, I don't know how you build strong relationships in this context. We're all learning it, and it's not easy.
Tom or LA?
Yeah, I think, as I said, we've been rolling out this initiative via Zoom in this very odd way. And all of those things that Jolie mentioned about, rural communities that don't have access, that or it's very spotty or whatever, makes all of that hugely difficult in the work we're doing. We're feeling our way really along as we go in terms of this. So as I said, there have been some interesting things as the community organizations we're working with are themselves figuring this out in their day-to-day lives of how they're dealing with their own communities and working it out, and then bringing that to the sort of table that we have. And it's resulted in some interesting rethinking of what they may be able to do related to our specific initiative. But I don't know that anybody really has concrete answers to this right now, because we're feeling our way in the dark, so to speak, of, well, does this work? Does that work? Can we try it this way? Can we use these features of a Zoom meeting and all that sort of stuff? And, and we're thinking, well, maybe when we have everybody together, let's use the breakout rooms and get, one of us in each of the breakout rooms and have smaller conversations, and which are maybe easier to have, and all of those kinds of things. But everybody's feeling their way in the dark, I think, on this. This is nobody expected it, and it's completely uncharted territory.
I think
Thanks,
that's
Tom.
so, Tom, it's completely uncharted. And one of the things that we actually did within the Correctional Service of Canada is we suspended all research. So, and we have not started it again. So any research that involved actually talking to staff or inmates and that kind of thing, we actually have largely suspended that, and partly because we didn't want to, we felt people were overburdened, and the last thing that that we wanted to do was add to them trying to sort out the complexities of their work and living conditions, etc., and then have a researcher come and talk about that. But we're revisiting that now because this is clearly going to, I think we thought at first it'd be a month or two and then we could be back at it, and that's clearly not going to work. So we need to have a rethink of that and where that fits in all the competing priorities and frankly stresses that people have in their lives right now. The other thing that I would say is, and I'm going to speak about this from a personal way now, is I actually find I've gotten used to doing the video thing, but I actually find the video thing very disconcerting, and I have from the beginning. I have never looked at myself more than I have looked at myself in the last 6 months. And so I think we need to allow for the fact that video and the virtual things that we do may not be comfortable for everyone, and that they may need to find other ways to communicate with you. And those ways may not be in a group. They may need to have, relationships are about groups, but they can also be about one-on-one conversations with each other. And this time, I think it's been really important, and what I've undertaken in my personal life that's outside of my work research is to really stop and have conversations about people and have those one-on-one, just a telephone conversation or, a socially distant coffee outside, although that'll be less helpful in a snowstorm probably, about how you actually, that you're concerned about them as a person and that you're drawing support from them as well to your own personal life. And I think in times like this, it may be more about prioritizing those things than prioritizing how we actually move forward in particular ways. And again, I totally agree. I don't know how, if you don't have a relationship already, you firmly establish that easily. In fact, I have found it not. If anybody has tips on how to do that, I would love to know that.
Great, thanks, LA. I know we have some questions starting to stack up into the chat, so I'm going to throw it over to Kelly, and Kelly will start to identify some questions for our workshop hosts or our workshop participants today. Take it away, Kelly.
Thanks, everyone who have been identifying questions and messaging throughout. This is great. The first question is going to be posed to all of the presenters that have an answer. So the first one being, what guidance do the presenters have for navigating institutional barriers or ideological difference in doing work in a good way? How can we as individuals help institutions to catch up in terms of Indigenous cultural approaches and importance of relationship building? You can even go a little bit further to touch, LA, if you'd like, a little bit on combining those concerns with donor, the difference between donor concerns and interests of the community. There's a couple questions in there that I'm just kind of lumping together for time's sake. So anyone who wants to start off can do so.
Well, I can start. I've almost lost my career trying to do things in the right way for Indigenous communities and peoples. And so I left my research director role with a research center that was housed in a university and took my research external to the university and started the Wellness Wheel with Dr. Skinner, because we are asked to do things within communities that are often not within bureaucratic alignment within the institution. And so as a First Nations person, I've had my neck on the line my entire career and have balanced losing my job on multiple occasions to do the right thing on the First Nation side. I can't speak to a non-Indigenous person's experience of that, but as an Indigenous scholar, you can ask any of us in the province. We have all damn near lost or have lost our careers or our jobs over doing the right thing for community. It's a very difficult thing. And when there is no law or rule against systemic racism nationally or provincially, it is very difficult to make the changes necessary. So the way our team solves it is by working as external to the health authority and the universities as we can, still knowing that we have to utilize those institutions to bring our grants in.
So maybe I'll add to that. And the first thing I think I would use is the word patience. Is that a lot of patience is required on both sides, and especially when there are ideological differences or there are differences around how you approach things, and especially when you're dealing with institutions. And I recognize that in many of my day-to-day work, I actually represent one of those government bureaucratic institutions, and I have struggled a lot with that on a personal level, is how you make that work. But I am a firm believer that you also make change from the inside. And so sometimes, there's change from the outside and forces that do that, and you can also make small changes on the inside over time. And but I think you have to allow for patience for the institution to learn along with you. That they're not going to be able to shift in one fell swoop to the way that you're seeing things. They're going to need patience, but they need to be open to learning. And that can be difficult too within bureaucratic structures, speaking that I work within one every day. I know there was the question about how do you weave in the donor's requirements? And this is where I think your experiences and skill as a researcher can really be something that you can give back with. So if you're there and you're establishing the relationships and you speak openly with the researcher or evaluator because you've established the relationships already about what the donor requires, often because we have experience, we can figure out how to weave these things together. So maybe if, for instance, you needed to know outcomes, you could do that in traditional ways like surveys, but maybe you could do that in a way that would help the organization by helping them coordinate focus groups that happen every 2 or 3 months with the people that are involved in whatever you're offering. And as part of those focus groups, saying at the end, and we need some feedback on this program to help us keep this funding moving forward. Here's how you could help us do that. So I think that there are ways to weave them together, but it does require planning to do that. It requires planning from the beginning about how to incorporate those pieces. And you probably all know this, but I'm going to say this again, governments like numbers. And so as much as I believe firmly in qualitative work, sometimes you need to gather numbers too and record those in some way. And I think it's important to think about how to do that from the beginning so you're not trying to hobble those together at the end. I hope that gives you a couple of ideas.
I would just like to add to that. I think if you utilize that two-eyed seeing, you would be able to, because that's really what I consider my job to be. I'm the translator. I'm the person that translates those high-level tri-council grants and that vernacular that they want. And how do I take that and turn it into like a sweat lodge in community? That's my job, to take that language, that high-level language, use that two-eyed seeing, translate it into an Indigenous way. And then when the Indigenous way is done and happened, then I evaluate it and word it in the way that they need to hear it. That's the two-eyed seeing, and that's the role that I have. That's the gift that I have, is to be able to meld that. So don't put that on the community to necessarily translate it to the funder. You do that piece by using that two-eyed seeing, but be transparent. Don't hide from the community, the funders' goals, because if it's like an extraction company or something like that, that shouldn't even be in our community. So really look at the funder. If the funder's tainted or got some shady stuff going on, we don't want that money. Let it go. So really think about the kind of money you're bringing to us, because I turn money away all the time because it's dirty and tainted. I don't hesitate to take drug money because those people are killing my people on the regular. But if you're extracting out of our communities, we don't want their money. So I think really be clear about the funding source, be transparent, but then also use that two-eyed seeing and that skill that you have to speak both languages and to translate that for them.
Yeah, and Jolie's right, I think, and I don't think anybody in Sphero has faced exactly the same kind of challenges. But when you are engaged in this sort of community-based, community-driven research, the institutional structures in which we live as university faculty are not geared to rewarding that in any serious way. And it really does trying to find the few champions inside the university, as LA was saying, who may in fact carve out some space that you can continue to push on to create the legitimacy for the kind of work that this is, because it does take so much longer to do this kind of work. And the reward system of the university is that publish or perish, and keep going and get on to the next grant and the next grant. And yet we're sitting here talking about long-term relationships and building these long-term commitments to being in communities. The universities there are places in the university where that is valued, but there are lots of places where it's still, you run up against it, and it becomes then incumbent, I think, on more senior people like myself, who don't have any more promotions to get and all of that, to be the one yelling and screaming at the university, because there's not much they can do to me in order to create that space for the younger scholars that are part of our unit as well. And as part of, I can take greater risks because of where I am than they can at their stage in their career. But those are really real barriers that I think, it's just a matter of continuing to push back against just the lack of understanding and appreciation of what it takes to do this kind of work and to do it well.
One of the things I would recommend, this isn't necessarily specific to evaluation, but for research, if you're doing research ethics and you have to do it through your university, and many of our communities have their own ethics, is that even though we are obligated to fill out the university ethics application, is I always add the community's ethics and I position it on top. And I say, while we have done your tri-council ethics application, the community's ethics are this. And it may be real, like one-page simple stuff, but I position it on top. That takes boldness on the part of a scholar, especially an untenured one, to challenge a system like that. You have to have some cojones to do this work. You cannot be meek and do this work. You have to be willing to challenge systems. You have to be willing to have a backbone and to stand up and to put your neck on the line. If you're not, probably not the work for you. And that's okay. There's lots of work out there, but think about what you're doing, because you're as much as an advocate as you are as a researcher doing this work.
Definitely
Wonderful.
agree with all of those comments. I wanted to see, Kelly, if you have, I've got some other questions coming in. Kelly, do you have a question loaded up?
Yes, there is one question here, and it kind of comes from, I think, a sense of thinking about billable hours. And so I'll just read the question as it's stated. So how do we get communities, organizations, or clients to pay fairly for our deep and long-term work? So I think looking for a little bit of how this is done practically, and how should maybe these conversations be engaged in when working in community. And I think this is mostly directed to LA from her comments made after the first set of questions, but I think any of the presenters here today can also comment if they have anything.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
That's fair. I did dig and ask for a little bit more context. So how to engage in the conversations around how much should be billed or not billed. I think this is coming from a place of a more formal consulting role when working in community before and after trying to maintain and develop those relationships. That makes more sense.
I'm just going to speak from my perspective. I've been an unpaid research director for 3 years. I don't know, like most of us do this work out of love and our sidelines, if we're academics. I don't charge community. I don't know, maybe non-Indigenous people do, but I don't.
I guess I can try and answer this, and I'm going to take it in a different perspective than Jolie, because I'm not an academic. Well, I am an academic, but that's not my primary job. And like Tom said, I actually don't have much on the line. I always say when I'm doing this outside of academia is fire me then, because I'm an adjunct and I do it all volunteer. And so I don't get paid for it if I'm doing it outside of my work time. And so with CSE. And so I'm always like, okay, if you don't like it, then I just will stop using your affiliation. That's fine. And so I don't face the same thing that many academics and young academics face about needing the publish and perish thing, which I actually, part of the reason I'm not in academia is I found that very disconcerting, that publish and perish piece. And so I had some opportunities to do work outside of academia. I will speak on a very practical level to what happens in my practice about when I am working in my CSC role and how we do things. When one of the things that I would actually get away from is billable hours. And so if you're hiring someone to do this, you're going to pay them money, which, as Jolie said, I'm not sure that's what I'd want to have happen. But if that was the case, you were hiring someone, I would actually talk in terms of deliverables rather than in terms of hours. So ask them to give you, to say, well, the deliverable is going to be these things. And that's where you actually can build in some of the things we talked about giving back to the community. So your deliverable is going to be a report for the funder. It's going to be, in addition, there's going to be a deliverable where you need to come and speak to our board and debrief them and take feedback from them as they work on help you with your interpretations. A deliverable could be that recipe book or that, thing you're going to give back to the community. And I have found that that is a much more effective way to deal with organizations than in billable hours. Because so often what happens in billable hours is they reach the end of the hours and then you never see them again and you never get the product that you need or the outcome that you want. And I think it encourages this parachuting in and parachuting out that we'd like to avoid. And so the idea of contracting for a deliverable is another way to think about it.
Yeah, and from our experience, we don't, when we're working with a community directly, and if there isn't an outside funder, we would do that work as scholarly work, and that would just be what we do, and we wouldn't charge anybody anything for that. With this, the project I talked about today, the Collective Impact Project, it's funded by ESDC. We get a small amount of time, and it's a small fraction of our actual time that we bill, but we bill that to ESDC. That money comes back to the unit, and that becomes part of our ability to run the unit, because we don't get any money from the University of Regina or from the University of Saskatchewan for the unit. So it's a way of generating a small amount of income for the unit, and then it goes back into other research initiatives and projects in communities, and it allows us to do sort of work directly with the community and not charge them anything. But if somebody needs a new computer in my unit, I can buy them one. So it's that, but we would never work that way in directly with a community where we would charge them. That would be, to me, that would be unethical. And also, yeah, and I would very much echo LA's comment about focus on the deliverable, not on billable hours and that, and focus on, if you're going to work with somebody, what are you going to leave back in that community and what's it going to look like? And that's when that you've actually, you're going to end up with something in the end, as opposed to them disappearing at some point.
Excellent advice. Michelle, just looking at time here, if you have other questions that you would like to ask, I will throw it back to you.
Great, thanks. We did have one person make an inquiry just to talk a little bit more about some of the resources that are available at the U of R. So one of which is the Community Engagement and Research Center. Lynn Jidluck, who is one of the kind of co-hosts of this session, is the community director at the Community Engagement and Research Center. Lynn, do you have just maybe 2-minute blurb or 1-minute blurb you can tell people about the CIRC, formerly the CRU?
Sure. Thank you for that, Michelle. I just encourage people to reach out if you have any questions. During non-COVID times, my normal approach would be just to sit down and have a coffee and learn about, your needs and just brainstorm. And half the battle with working with the university is knowing the right person to talk to. And I don't know all the answers, but I know a lot of really smart people that I can reach out for. And that's just basically, I consider myself, when people ask me what my role is at the university, I say that I'm a matchmaker, but then once the match has come forward, I also take the next step and become the relationship coach. So I'm helping navigate those two worlds so that the community understands where the university is coming from and vice versa.
Great, thanks, Lynn. And so for folks that are thinking like, what is the Community Engagement Research Center? That was what was formerly known as the Community Research Unit. So that's an organization housed within the Faculty of Arts. Lynn is the community director, and Amber Fletcher is the academic director of that unit. I was fortunate to work with Lynn there for a number of years. I think what we're trying to look at today in general is how to sort of, oh, one second, sweetie. How to bring ourselves together as a group of researchers, evaluators, community members, and sort of a really holistic approach to doing the best ways we can to support community work. I have someone that's really, there we go. We've got an arm. There we go. They can see your arm. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and start to wind us down now. I think one thing that I would want to do is a very quick virtual or digital thank you and high fives to our great group of panelists. You can show your digital fingers, your real fingers, your high fives. Thanks so much for taking the time today. Our audience for taking the time to join us, and for the great questions that you asked, and for our panelists today and sharing your own insight. You're getting high fives from an audience here as well. We were really fortunate to have this collaboration between the University of Regina and the City of Regina to try to bring together this series that's trying to think about this question of impact in the work that we do, and the ethics and the practices that we do, and the best ways to support those that work in the community sector, our communities, the individuals in our communities, and the important work that we can do here on Treaty 4 territory and the other treaty territories that you live in, or the unceded territories that you live in for that matter. One thing I think I would take away from today, is, Jolie gave us we had the 4 and has now become the 5 R's. I think of from my own work, kind of the 4 Ds. Decentering the types of expertise and knowledge that we kind of engage with. So decentering these expectations around knowledge, or challenging those expectations around knowledge, deconstructing and demystifying the methods, the practices, and the dissemination of the projects that we do. And ultimately, I think a lot of this is really about decolonizing the relationships and the practices that surround evaluation, so that we can have really robust, sustainable, and ethical collaborations in the communities that we work in the communities that we live in, and the communities that we engage with. So thanks again to all of our participants today. Thanks to our audience. As has been mentioned, Jolie is making her deck available. That information will be sent out. There's a number of little resources here in the chat. And so what I thought I would do is end us maybe a minute or so early so that folks can go through, because there's a great list of resources. There's articles in there, there's web pages, there's ways to follow our speakers. And thanks again to those that have put this session together, and for the critical feedback, including feedback on the agenda that we got prior to starting. So thanks everyone, and have a great day. And we'll just leave the session open for a few minutes so that folks can maybe jog through and take information out of the chat site. Thank you.
Michelle, do you think that they could save the chat and email the chat with to the audience?
Yeah, Lynn, can you download the chat? It'll allow it to be a transcript as well.
Yeah, so I can do that. I was planning on sending the links and the resources, so that'll be easier.
Oh, okay.
Than that. So Jolie, if you can send me your slide deck, I'll send that along with the survey as well as the Zoom recording, because there are some people that couldn't attend today that really did want to take part in the conversation.
I'll send you the slides right now.
Great.
Perfect.
Thanks so much, folks. I know that our numbers are starting to go down, but thanks again, Tom, LA, and Jolie.
It was fun. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Lovely to join you.
Thanks.
Bye.